today we are very glad to have Professor Peter Zinoman to share with us his most recent work on Vietnamese reform communism in the 1950s. And it's actually the third of the series of lecture series Professor Zinoman offers to our institute for the previous two days. And some of you might have attended the lecture, so you might have known Professor Peter Zinoman. But I think for some of you who may not have the chance to attend the previous talks, I think I still need to give a brief introduction. Okay. Professor Zinoman is works in the Department of History of Southeast Asian Studies in the UC Berkeley. And he's the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Vietnamese Studies. And he was also a director of Advanced Vietnamese Summer Institute and a director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. And he has published many works on Vietnamese history, including his most recent book, Vietnamese Colonial Republican, The Political Vision of Vu Trong Phung, which was actually the topic of the talk yesterday. And he has also, he is the translator, one of the translators of the work, I don't know whether you consider it the most important work by Vu Trong Phung, but it's the work of one of the most maybe important writer in northern Vietnam, whose name is Vu Trong Phung, and the novel is called Dawn Log. And I think that actually helps people outside Vietnam to have the chance to get to know Vietnamese literature. And also he has a award-winning book, The Colonial Bastille, A History of Imprisonment in Vietnam, 1862 to 1940s, which is a study on prison or the system of prison in the colonial Vietnam. Okay, and apart from books, he has published many works, many articles on different aspects of Vietnamese history. And today, he's going to share with us his most recent work, and the topic of the talk is Nam Vang Jai Phang, and Vietnamese reform communism in the 1950s. And in this talk, Professor Zinoman will provide a detailed account of the emergence and the development of the movement, and he will emphasize how the movement should be understood in the broader context of the international communist movement in the 1950s, and all those associated with all those events in the USSR, Hungary, Poland, and as well as China. And he will also show how this movement has been defined or redefined or even reappropriated for different political purposes. And he will show us through his research based on his very extensive and meticulous archival work. He will offer his own interpretation of the nature of the movement and also his own evaluation of the importance of the movement. So let's welcome Professor Zinoman.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm very happy to be here and appreciate everyone for coming. And I'm going to talk about this newish project of mine, a project that focuses on a democracy movement, a reform communist movement that emerges in Vietnam in the 1950s. And my talk today is maybe a little bit more formal than yesterday or the day before. I'm going to read most of it, but I'll try to go slow so that hopefully people can follow it and can understand it. Nguyen Zai Phum was the biggest and most famous domestic protest movement in the history of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the history of North Vietnam or Communist Vietnam, prior to the current reform era. The current reform era begins in the late 1980s. The movement takes its name from two independent journals. One journal called Nguyen Văn and one journal called Zai Phum, Nhân Văn meaning humanity, and Zai Phum meaning masterpieces or master works. And these two journals are published openly in Hanoi during the fall of 1956, between roughly September and December of 1956, just 2 years after the foundation of the communist government or the communist state in the summer of 1954. Produced by a famous cohort of intellectuals, lawyers, writers, academics, artists, and poets, these two journals attacked the dictatorial and repressive character of communist rule in northern Vietnam and called for a range of liberalizing reforms. Ho Chi Minh's government closed the journals in December of 1956, but the movement survived, albeit under significant stress, for another year or two until about 1960. In that year, 1960, most members of the groups were sent away for terms of reformative labor, and a handful were put on trial in a kind of show trial and sentenced to jail. Following release, either from reformative labor or from prison, several score members of the movement, maybe about 60 or 70 people, remained the victims of a special regime of police surveillance, institutional discrimination, and restricted civil rights that stretched on for about 30 years until the late 1980s. Can everyone understand me? Yeah, that clear?
Yeah.
The appearance of these journals in this particular historical moment was no accident. 1956 was the year of Nikita Khrushchev's famous speech at the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. 1956 was also the year of the Polish and Hungarian crises and uprisings. It was also, of course, the year of the 100 Flowers campaign in China. Inspired by these developments, Nhân Văn Zai Phum championed a localized revisionist or reform communist agenda designed to save and renew Vietnamese communism through a rejection of the Stalinist model and a return to Leninist humanism. This involved an attack on the local incarnation of the, quote, cult of personality, and the promotion of socialist legality, intellectual freedom, expanded democracy, and greater protection for human and civil rights. For 3 months, between September and late November, early December 1956, Nhân Văn and Zai Phum, along with a handful of other short-lived, less well-known journals, promoted this basic anti-Stalinist agenda through a mix of essays, editorials, fiction, poetry, interviews, and political cartoons. Nhân Văn Zai Phum had local roots as well. So far I've mentioned these sort of international contexts, Khrushchev, Hungary, Poland, the 100 Flowers movement. Clearly Nhân Văn and Zai Phum are responding to that international stimulus. But there's also a local context out of which it comes. One important local context was the Vietnamese Communist Party's move to the left, or you might say lurch to the left, radical move to the left, following the Chinese Communist victory on the mainland in 1949. This move was most clearly evident in the introduction of what's known as the land reform, Cải cách ruộng đất, a Maoist-style campaign of violent social engineering that the party imposed on a terrorized northern Vietnamese countryside between 1953 and 1956. Official efforts to redress the injustices of the land reform through an inept and disruptive correction of errors campaign in mid-1956 only served to further erode confidence in the party leadership. Members of Nhân Văn Zai Phum denounced both the land reform and the persistence of a regime of censorship in North Vietnam that prevented the media from honestly examining the excesses and the horrors of the campaign. This kind of support for intellectual freedom made Nguyen Van Zai Pham especially popular on college and university campuses. Students are a very large constituency for the movement. I think another important local context for the emergence of the movement was the post-war character of Hanoi at the time. There had been a war in Vietnam between the Viet Minh, Ho Chi Minh's movement, and France between 1946 and 1954, and leaders of Nguyen Van Zai Pham had all, virtually all, 95% of them, participated in that resistance movement against the French and on the side of the Viet Minh. This experience was a kind of credential, and it made them confident in their right to have their voices heard on a matter of broad public concern. I think it's actually hard to imagine that this group would have been so brave, so confident, to have so much chutzpah, to speak out in public in the way that they did, had they not felt that they had earned that right through their participation in the resistance. Many of these figures were unhappy at the failure of promises made by party officials during the war that restrictions on freedom of expression would be relaxed when the fighting was over. So a lot of these figures had accepted greater social and cultural control during the resistance, with the understanding that when the war with France was over, that regime would end. The war ended, that regime didn't end, and so that was one of the spurs for them to rise up. Nguyen Van Zai Pham is significant in modern Vietnamese history for several reasons. One is its unusual size. Roughly 60 people, 6-0, wrote for these journals, and several hundred sympathizers exhibited sufficient public support for the movement to be targeted for punishment by the police after the journals were closed down. One issue of Nguyen Van sold about 20,000 copies. While not quite a mass movement, I don't think you can quite call Nguyen Van Zai Pham a mass movement, Nguyen Van Zai Pham's size, its duration, and its popularity exceeds by a wide margin that of every other domestic protest movement in North Vietnam or in communist Vietnam prior to the mid-1980s. Now, I have to also point out that it's the biggest and it's the biggest protest movement, domestic protest movement, and it lasts the longest. That doesn't mean that it's that big or it lasts that long. It's, you know, there's maybe 60 people who write for it. There's only 3 months that the journals come out, so we're not actually talking about something that long. But if you look at other episodes of domestic resistance to the communist regime, there's nothing that's even close to that long. We have, you know, a novel here or a speech there, a case here or there. But this movement, part of the reason it's so important is that there's so little resistance in North Vietnam. There's so little domestic resistance. Part of the reason for that is that North Vietnam is at war for much of this period, from the 50s to the 80s, and of course war makes it a very difficult environment for domestic protest, right? Nguyen Van Zai Pham's importance also lies, I believe, in the intensity and persistence of the party's campaign against it. Long after the movement's destruction by the party in 1960, communist officials continued to denounce the movement publicly and to vilify and persecute its members. Virtually everyone associated with Nguyen Van Zai Pham was silenced in the public sphere for over a generation, and leading figures in the movement were quietly rehabilitated only in the late 1980s. The repression of Nguyen Van Zai Pham during the late 1950s is also important for giving rise to the basic institutional infrastructure still in operation today for policing Vietnamese artists and intellectuals. And this, what I'm talking about here, is a kind of interlocking network of professional organizations known as the Writers Association, the Music Association, the Theater Association, the Fine Arts Association, the Hội Nhà văn, the Hội Sân khấu, the Hội âm nhạc. All of these associations are founded between 1957 and 1960, and they're founded quite explicitly as part of an effort to police and control the types of people who have played a role in Yangon Zaifang. And those institutions still exist today, and I would argue are still the most important instruments for controlling dissident voices in those fields. Okay, so these are a couple of reasons for the importance or the significance of the movement. Its size, its duration, and the intensity of the party's repression, the creation of an institutional infrastructure to repress the movement that endures over a long period of time. But there's one more reason, one final reason why I think this movement is really, really significant and really important. And that is because of the extraordinary elite nature of its membership. This is not a movement that is made up by unknown people or minor figures. It's actually made up of some of the most important celebrities, cultural celebrities, intellectual celebrities in the country. And so I want to take a minute now and talk a little bit about some of the key members. Trần Đức Thao becomes close to Sartre, publishes quite a bit in his journal throughout the late 1940s. 1951, Trần Đức Thao publishes his great work of philosophy entitled Phenomenology and Dialectical Materialism. His work is engaged by the philosopher Louis Althusser, and there's a public back and forth, a public debate between Trần Đức Thao and Althusser. Again, for Vietnamese philosophy, it's sort of the one time we have a figure who's on the public stage, international stage, interacting at this level with European philosophy. Go ahead. Yeah.
这一位哲学家呢，就是基本上Zinoman 教授认为说，这可能是越南有史以来最有名的一个哲学家。那他做的是西方哲学，特别是他的老师以及他当时候有互动的一些人都是非常有名的人。那他的老师就是现象学者梅洛庞蒂。那他做的是跟胡塞尔有关的研究。OK， 那刚才一个比较重要的就是他在大概40年代的时候，他曾经发表过一些文章，那是在沙特出版的一个刊物里面，就是叫做《当代》那他的一个作品，一个特别主要的作品讨论dialectical materialism， 就是所谓辩证唯物论。那当时候跟法国另外一个也是在战后影响非常深远的这个马克思主义学者，就是阿图瑟。我想这可能是大家比较常听到阿图瑟的那一个学派有一些比较深刻或者是重要的辩论。那其实他的那个作品后来也在其他一些我们听到比较熟悉的法国当代的思想家，像是德希达等等的一些作品里面，其实都曾经提到。那可能同学们在读到的时候，不会意识到这个人，就是说因为这个大家大概可以了解嘛。那所以就是这一位哲学家，他在这个运动里面的那个角色也非常的重要。那大概跟同学们解释一下。
Trần Đức Thao returns to Vietnam in 1952, joins the Viet Minh in the countryside, in the liberated zones, and in 1954 returns to Hanoi. For the first time he's been back to Hanoi since the 1930s when he left for France as a student. Another important member of the movement is this guy right here, Dao Duy Anh. Dao Duy Anh, one could argue, is Vietnam's greatest cultural historian and lexicographer. In the early 1930s, he compiles a famous Vietnamese-Chinese dictionary and a Vietnamese-French dictionary. These dictionaries were produced in 1932 and 1936, and they remain today sort of towering achievements in the field of Vietnamese linguistics and lexicography. He also wrote an extremely influential early nationalist history of Vietnamese Confucianism, and he produced a massive kind of encyclopedic study of the great Vietnamese national poem, Truyện Kiều, or the Tale of Kiều, called Dictionary of the Tale of Kiều. During the First Indochina War, do we want to say something? During the First Indochina War, during the resistance, Dao Xuyan joins the Viet Minh, goes into liberated zones, and he actually becomes a very important teacher during this period of younger resistance intellectuals, writers, poets, historians, etc. Much more could be said about Dao Xuyan, but suffice it to say that he's arguably the most important linguist and historian of the late colonial era. A fourth member of the movement is this guy, Trung Tu. This is one of the country's most prolific and interesting literary scholars. He's, I think, one of the first critics to apply Marxism in a relatively rigorous way to the study of Vietnamese literature in the early 1930s. He's one of the first critics to introduce Freud and Freudian analysis into the study of literature later in the 1930s. As you might guess, he's a very close friend of Vu Trong Phung, and when Vu Trong Phung dies, he's one of the people who organizes a lot of the commemorations of him. Like Vu Trong Phung, he is rumored to have Trotskyist leanings, but it actually is not strong evidence that he is a Trotskyist. He's quite hard to classify politically or ideologically. Like Vu Trong Phung, he comes from a very poor, modest background. He's totally self-educated, and his ideas are very sort of autodidact, quirky, not easy to put into any kind of general box. He's very, very prolific, very brilliant, I think. He joins the Viet Minh, ends up in liberated zones, becomes one of the important figures who writes for this movement in 1956. Here's a couple of other members of the movement. I'm not going to speak as much about them. Nguyen Sang and Nguyen Sinh Ao. These are artists, painters, who are very promising during the late 1930s and the Second World War. They join the resistance, and they produce propaganda art for the Viet Minh during the resistance. But they are they're recognized as extremely talented artists. Still today, they're often seen as two of the four great 20th century Vietnamese painters. And they're the guys who produced the cover art for Nguyen Van and Zai Pham, and they make a lot of the cartoons and caricatures. Another member of the movement is Van Cao. Van Cao is a very beloved poet and musician who joins the Viet Minh in 1944. He writes hundreds of patriotic songs to serve the resistance during World War II and during the First Indochina War against France. One of his songs eventually is adopted as the national anthem. It becomes the national anthem of the DRV upon the foundation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam when the state is first founded in fall of 1945. And it remained the national anthem throughout the Vietnam War, the Second Indochina War, despite Van Cao's role in the movement, despite the fact that he's punished and becomes a kind of persona non grata. He's not allowed to be a public figure after the repression of the movement. His songs are so beloved and his national anthem is so well thought of that it continues to be the national anthem, even though he's now no longer a public figure. Here's three more important figures of the movement. On the left is Truong Theo Bao. This is a less well-known figure. He is a publisher, an independent publisher, who joins the anti-French resistance and handles a lot of the printing for Ho Chi Minh's government from liberated zones during the late 40s and early 50s. And when the new government is established in Hanoi in 1954, one interesting thing is it does not immediately shut down all private printing presses. It does eventually, but in 1954-55, some private presses are allowed to continue. Truong Theo Bao is one of these guys who's allowed to continue to run essentially a private publishing house under the communist government. And it's his publishing house that actually prints Zinoman and Zai Fung. On the right is this figure whose name is at the bottom, Nguyen Hieu Dang. Nguyen Hieu Dang is typically seen as the organizational mastermind of the movement. He recruits the editors and many of the writers for the journals. He raises the money and the resources that allows them to flourish. He also is a writer and writes not fiction, but he writes kind of theoretical pieces, political manifestos, political commentary for the journals. Unlike the other figures, he's less of an artist or a scholar and more of a professional political activist. Nguyen Hieu Dang joins the party in 1943. He's an underground activist during World War II. He's one of the main organizers of the massive independence ceremony held in Hanoi on September 2nd, 1945, when Ho Chi Minh announces that Vietnam has the famous Declaration of Independence. Nguyen Hieu Dang is one of the guys who organizes that. And then Ho Chi Minh names him to be the first Minister of Propaganda and Minister of Youth in the first DRV communist government in 1945-46. So he's really a politician and an activist and a political theorist, not a scholar or a writer or a poet. But he is clearly one of the most important kind of founding figures, organizational figures behind the movement. Finally, in the middle, we have this character Thuy An. Now she is obviously unique in that she's the only woman who's associated with the movement, and she is an extremely interesting and unique figure. At the age of 13 in 1929, Thuy An won a national poetry contest and was awarded a medal by the Vietnamese emperor in a kind of big public ceremony. So she was sort of a very precocious, talented teenager. In the early 1930s, she emerges as a very important female journalist, and she edits two women's magazines during the 1930s, Dan Ba and Dan Ba Mui, one in Hanoi and one in Saigon. She also writes novels and short stories during this time. In 1942, a great Vietnamese literary scholar named Vu Trong Phung, you've heard of Vu Trong Phung, a very important Vietnamese literary scholar, produces an important 3-volume work called Modern Vietnamese Writers, Nhan Hiện Đại Vietnam. And this is the first effort to establish a canon of modern Vietnamese writers. Vu Trong Phung writes about 60 different Vietnamese writers from the period of 1900 to 1940. Vu Trong Phung obviously is one of them, but there's 59 other writers who Vu Trong Phung says these are our new great Vietnamese writers. They're all writing primarily in the Romanized script. And 59 of these 60 writers are men. There's one woman, Thuy An. She's the only woman in the collection. So she's a very singular kind of figure, very unusual in this sense. She's also unusual in that she's the only member of Nhan Zai Phum who does not join the resistance, who does not go into the liberated zones during the First War. Instead, she stays in the cities, which are controlled by the French and controlled by the Vietnamese government, the Bao Dai government that collaborates with the French. And she continues to work as a journalist, as an activist. It appears that she was sympathetic to the Viet Minh, but she decided that she could do more valuable work from within French-controlled areas, although there's some controversy about what her political allegiances are during this time. She also famously, during this period, translates the American novel Gone with the Wind into Vietnamese. So she has many different hats and does many different things. Very, very interesting figure. Finally, I'm not going to talk about these guys that much. We have these 4 figures, Trân Dân, Hoang Gum, Phung Quan and Le Dat. These guys are all members of the Viet Minh military. They're soldiers, but they're also poets. And the Viet Minh military has a cultural unit that tries to help the morale of the other troops and to write inspirational poetry and songs, put on plays, etc., to keep the spirits of the resistance up. These four young guys are seen as the most brilliant members of this unit, and they're very talented young literary figures. Probably the most famous is Tran Dun, the first one, who writes a novel in the fall of 1954 that's called Nguyen Lup Lup, Men Men Wave Waves, which is a account of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, a kind of heroic description of the victory over the French at this great anti-colonial battle. These four guys are from a slightly different generation from the people I've shown you so far. They're a little bit younger, and unlike the other ones, they're not really famous during the late colonial period. No one really knows. They become famous during the resistance, but the other individuals have already established their fame and their celebrity during the 1920s and especially the 1930s. So this movement, it's worth thinking about its membership as having two different groups. A kind of older group of late colonial celebrities, poets, musicians, artists, etc., and a younger group of military writers and poets who are also participating. Okay, so those are, getting back to my, my bigger point, why do I spend so much time talking about these guys? The reason why this movement is so important is because of who these guys are. It's not just what they write. It's not just the bravery of their voice. It's not the content. It's, these are the most important intellectuals in the country who are joining this movement. People listen to these guys. They respect these guys. And I think that's, really has to be underlined in trying to figure out why this movement is as important as it does. Now, there exists a small, interesting body of scholarship on Nguyen Van Zai Pham, but it suffers from some serious limitations. Essentially, what scholars in the past have had to analyze and describe this movement is the writings of the members of the movement itself. So the journals and newspapers that these guys write, even though they're banned, they survive in secret form and they're kept in some libraries. And with the emergence of the internet, they go online. You can go online now and you can find all of the issues of Nguyen Van and all of the issues of Zai Pham, all of the content. It's been available for about 10, 15 years. And so there's an early wave of scholarship, including some earlier work that I did, an article that I wrote, which basically analyzes their writings. And there's also available communist newspapers, communist press of the era that writes about the movement and criticizes the movement, and that's also been available. And almost all of the scholarship has been based essentially on this quite narrow body of material, their writings themselves, and a little bit of the writing in the communist press about them. In the late 1980s, when these guys are very old and when they're sort of rehabilitated for the first time, allowed to come out of the darkness, allowed to speak in public a little bit, there's a series of interviews that some journalists conduct with them. There's a Vietnamese journalist in Paris named Huy Quay who has a radio program, and she actually interviews a bunch of them. They're now all in their 70s or 80s. She interviews them on the radio and transcribes the interviews and publishes them. And there's some insight into the movement that comes from these interviews. But at this time, one, these people are all very old. Secondly, they've had a very rough life. The last 30 years, they've basically been unemployed, starving, persecuted, forced to take part in manual labor. They're scared. And so what they say in the 1980s is not, for historians, there's something limited about its value. Clearly they're cautious and they're still scared that there might be some repercussions for them for speaking out. So there's something interesting about what they say, and some interesting scholarship that's based on what they say, but it's still very limited. And in the last decade, they've all died. So none of them are alive anymore. What's been missing from the scholarship is contemporaneous, unpublished Vietnamese archival material about the movement and its repression by the party. The archives, the Communist Party archives, have been closed, and the movement remains very sensitive in Vietnam today, and so none of that material has been made available. And the absence of this material has left big holes in the existing scholarship. In general, we know a lot more about the political project of this movement. We know sort of what they advocated for, what they wanted, what they believed. Then we know about how the movement was viewed by the party, how it was repressed by the party, how it was dealt with by the party. That sort of documentary evidence has not been available to scholars. It's been closed. While the archives of the party remain closed today, you can't go into Vietnamese Communist Party archives, especially foreign scholars. There's no opportunity to do that. Archives of the Vietnamese state, including government ministries and the National Assembly, have been open to researchers starting in the late 1990s. And there's an archive in Hanoi known as Archive Number 3, where you can basically go and request material from the Ministry of Education, from the Ministry of Police, from the Ministry of Agriculture. All the ministries' files are there. And if you spend enough time there, it's possible to find material on topics that you might think are off limits and are sensitive. During several months of research at Archive Number 3 in 2014 and 2015, I was very lucky to stumble across several bodies of archival material about Nguyen Van Dai Phum and its suppression. Basically, I came across 3 different bodies of material. The first was a series of internal reports about the repression of the movement, including, and this is actually what I'm going to talk mostly about today, a 30-page report by a man named Nguyen Xuan Dung, who was a judge who presided over a trial, a show trial, that was organized to prosecute 5 members of Nguyen Van Dai Phum in 1960. This was, in fact, the only trial associated with the repression of Nguyen Van Dai Phum. Everyone else who was associated with the movement was punished administratively or through extrajudicial means. There was no trial. They were just sent away to farms to work, or they were punished through their professional organizations. They were kicked out of their offices. But for some reason, 5 of them were put on trial. And so one of the things I found was this 30-page report by the judge. The report is dated April 11th, 1960. April 11th, 1960 is 3 months after the trial took place on January 19th, 1960. And this report features a wealth of new material about the government's investigation of the movement, the pre-trial interrogation of the defendants, and how this trial was staged and organized in Hanoi. A second interesting body of documents that I found in the archives was a trove of about 1,000 letters written by ordinary citizens, North Vietnamese citizens, to the National Assembly, denouncing Nguyen Van Dai Phum and calling on the party to punish the members. And these letters were, it's really very interesting, they were written after the party organized meetings in different units in factories and schools and hospitals in which the journals were read aloud to people and then were explained why the journals were subversive, why the people behind them were counter-revolutionary, and then the audience was encouraged to write letters. In some cases, a single letter might have 100 signatures. In some cases, a single letter might have one signature. And the letters, some of them are written by all the employees of a single office, including some famous people. The Institute of History, for example, all of the historians sign a letter denouncing Nguyen Zai Pham, even though some members of Nguyen Zai Pham are members of the Institute. But here we see this very damning letter describing how outraged the letter writers are by the content of the journals and how important it is for the party to punish these people. So they both describe outrage and they describe calling for punishment. And I'm currently sort of analyzing these letters and trying to figure out, if there's some patterns in the content and what they're calling for. And then there's a third source that I found, which is a number of files that shed light on connections between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Communist Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the rest of the communist world, in particular Eastern Europe, during the period between 1954 and 1960. And these are files that show the visit to North Vietnam of people from Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Soviet Union, Eastern Germany, Bulgaria, as part of early efforts at cultural exchange and intellectual exchange. Actors, musicians, puppeteers, journalists, folk dancers. So there's a part of the archive that describes the organization of these trips, both of people from Eastern Europe coming to North Vietnam and North Vietnamese dancers, actors, journalists, etc., going to Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia as part of these missions of socialist fraternity. And one thing that you learn from these files is that there's quite significant intercourse and interaction between Eastern European intellectuals and North Vietnamese intellectuals. And a lot of the ideas that you find in the journals, ideas about Stalin, ideas about Khrushchev, ideas about de-Stalinization, it looks like this is an important highway, an important means by which these anti-Stalinist ideas circulate throughout the communist world during this early period of the Cold War. I could talk about all three of these bodies of material, but for the remainder of my talk, I basically want to focus on this first source that I talked about, this report by the judge about this show trial that's held in January 1960. In many ways, it's the most valuable document I found, the most unexpected document I found, and one that sheds light on elements of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and its political culture that I think has never really been illuminated before. There are several puzzling features about this trial that remain unexplained to this day. First, the trial lumps together and targets 5 individuals who have very different levels of connection to the movement. The 5 people are Nguyen Hue Dang, right? This guy on the right, actually, here, let me go this way. This guy on the right, Nguyen Hue Dang. This guy on the left, Tran Thio Bao, the publisher, Thuy An, the woman in the middle, and then 2 other people, someone named Phan Thai and someone named Nguyen Le Chi, who are not considered major members of the movement at all. And indeed, the only one of these 5 people who's considered a leading figure in the movement is Nguyen Hue Dang. Nguyen Hue Dang helps found the journal, helps raise money for them, helps run them, and he writes in the journals. Tran Thio Bao publishes them, but he doesn't write for them. Thuy Anh never writes for them either, but she is friendly and is known to associate with figures who are connected to the movement. But she has no writing in any of the journals, and there's no evidence that she has any kind of critical role in it. And these 5 people are put on trial together for their participation in the journal. So it's very curious as to why they choose these 5 people to make an example of. A second unexplained puzzle, a second confusing thing about the trial, is the decision of the court to try these 5 defendants for espionage, for spying, based on the charge that these journals had been founded under the orders of foreign imperialist agents who were connected to the French, the Americans, and the anti-communist Ngo Dinh Diem regime in the South. I should add that neither of these 2 puzzles, why or is it these 5 people, and why are they charged with espionage? They're the only ones who are charged with espionage. Neither of these puzzles is actually solved by this report. He doesn't explain why. But the report does shed light on some other interesting elements of the case that I want to turn to now. We know a little bit about the trial previously because the newspapers in the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, in particular Nhân Dân, which is the official newspaper of the party, publishes a notice in January that reports on the trial. And prior to my finding this document, that newspaper article was really the main piece of information about this trial. And basically, that article described 3 things about the trial. It described how the evidence presented at the trial showed that these 5 individuals had been involved in a plot that entailed collusion and plotting, meeting in dark alleyways late at night and exchanging envelopes, or organizing secret transfers of money for the journal, having connections with foreign spies, etc. So the trial proved a kind of plot of these people working together in tandem with foreigners to launch the journals. The newspaper article also described the confessions that these 5 defendants all made at the trial, and the confessions are very thorough and complete and fulsome, and the newspaper article says all 5 of the defendants completely admit that they're guilty of espionage, they admit that they participated in this. Here's their confessions that show without any doubt that they have done this. And thirdly, the newspaper article announces their sentences. Nguyen Hio Dang and Thuy Anh are both sentenced to 15 years in prison, pretty long, hard sentences. And Tran Thio Bao is given a 10-year prison sentence. The other 2 figures, the more minor figures, were given 5- and 6-year sentences. In addition, each of the defendants is given an additional 5 years of suspension of their civil rights when they get out of jail. In general, this newspaper article presents the trial as an extremely smooth and efficient operation. The evidence presented against the defendants is overwhelming. The state prosecutors present a completely persuasive and convincing case. The defendants are portrayed as totally repentant and sorry. They confess to everything. They admit their guilt. They're never going to do it again. There's no trace of any resistance on their part to the trial. They're portrayed in the newspaper as completely passive. Moreover, although about 500 people attend the trial, it's a public trial, we know there's an audience there, the newspaper article provides no information about how they respond to the trial. Indeed, this large audience is never once mentioned in the press reporting, nor is there any reference to public opinion about the case. It's not even part of the discussion. As you might expect, a very different picture of the trial emerges in the report written by the presiding judge, Nguyen Xuan Dung. Entitled The Experience of the Court Regarding the Subversive Counter-Revolutionary Spy Case of Nguyen Hil Dang and Thuy An, this report includes a description of the process whereby the defendants are charged with espionage, a review of the content of the police file against them, a detailed discussion of the interrogation of the defendants, and a description of the trial itself. The Nguyen Xuan Dung report also acknowledges, albeit in passing, that the verdict for the trial was prepared by the court before the trial. Now, this is not surprising, right? This is sort of what you expect from a show trial, but it's actually valuable to see it confirmed in an archival document, right? We long suspect that these kind of trials are not really trials, they're more like theater. But one thing that the Nguyen Xuan Dung report says is, oh yeah, before we started the trial, we received the verdict. And so that the fact that the verdict comes in before the trial is very useful confirmation about how this event is staged. In each of these areas, the report paints a picture that departs significantly from the version of events presented in the press reporting. And so I want to now turn to some of these differences and some of the insights that the report presents about the trial. I think one of the most significant revelations found in this report by the judge is that the four bureaucratic offices or four bureaucratic organs of the state who are interested in the case, there's four bodies: the police, the prosecutor, the court, and the party central committee. So that's three state organizations. The police, the prosecutor, and the court are all state organizations. The central committee is a party organization. One thing that the report shows is that these four organs disagree over whether or not the defendants should be charged for espionage and should be charged as spies. This issue is controversial because no one else who was punished for their involvement in Nhân Văn Giải Phóng was charged for espionage. According to the report, the trial was initiated when the security police turned over to the state prosecutor a file about the case. Based on the content of the file, the police advised the prosecutor that they should charge the defendants for the following crime, and I quote, "The defendants took advantage of the rights to freedom and democracy, freedom of the press, freedom to publish, and freedom of assembly in order to spread subversive propaganda, to blacken the regime, to incite the masses, and to marshal forces to provoke an uprising." So this is the crime that the police and the court thinks that these defendants are guilty of. It's an interesting crime to basically say, in communist Vietnam, we have freedom of speech, we have freedom of democracy, we have the freedom to publish, and what these criminals are guilty of is using those freedoms against the government. And it's interesting, this crime is based on a statute in the Constitution of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Article 38. It's an article that's still in operation today, and it's still used to punish dissidents. When dissidents today are accused and put on trial and put in jail, they're often accused of using their freedoms that the state gives them against the state. So here we see, this is the first idea about what these criminals will be charged with. According to the report, the prosecutor and the court then prepared to try the case with regard to these crimes. In the